Okay, this is Chapter 5, homework problem number 1. We've got the Lundin Soda's bottling department had 15,000 units in the beginning inventory of work in process. I'm going to circle that 15,000 units. This was on September 1st. It says during September that there was 125,000 units were started into production, so we're going to need that number. And then at the end of the month, they gave you September 30th, you have 29,000 units left in ending inventory for work in process. This problem wants you to summarize the workflow. So the two equations that you need to know, I'm going to remind you over here, is what you do is you take your beginning work in process units and you simply add the units that just started during the period. When you do that, that gives you your total physical units. Now in this problem, they told you that you had 15,000 units in beginning inventory. You're going to go ahead and add that 125,000 units to the 15. That's going to give you 140,000 units total physical. So if you look at the solution, that's what they're basically showing you right over here. Now to verify that, the other equation, what you do is you take the units that you either completed and transferred out, write this transferred out right here. You add your ending work in process, and that's the other equation. It should also give you your total physical units. Now here's the trick. In this problem, they didn't tell you what they transferred out. They told you beginning WIP, they told you started, and they told you ending work in process. So if we know this equation and we know that our total physical units have to be 140, what I always tell my lecture students is I just go ahead and I plug that number down here. I'm going to say I know my total physical is 140,000. I go back into the problem. They told you that the ending work in process was 29,000 units. They told you that right there. So essentially, to figure out the transferred out units, think of that as simply, that's what I call a plug number. Just take the difference. Take 140,000, subtract out the 29,000, and that's going to give you 111,000 units, and that's the second part to the problem. Okay, Chapter 5, homework problem number 2. We've got the client's packaging department had the following information at January 31st. Here's the thing. It says all direct materials are added at the end of conversion process. So we'll need to know that a little bit later. It says that the units in ending work in process inventory were only 32% of the way through conversion. And then this icon, I already clicked it, but essentially when you click this icon, they're going to show you this part. They're going to already give you the physical flow of units. They will tell you completed and transferred out, and they will tell you the ending work in process units. What they will not tell you is how to get the equivalent units. So the way you would get the equivalent units essentially is we have to look at our percent completion. So what I tend to do in my classes, I always set up just kind of fiction a percent complete column where I've got my transferred out units and I've got my ending work in process units. So in this case, again, they told us 119,000 and 18,000 was the numbers. I'm going to put this over here, my percent completion. So the transferred out is always implied 100% complete, and that one's usually given. So if you look over here at the solution, you'll see this in the first row. What they basically do is they just take this 119,000 and multiply it by 1. They just copy it across because those are completed and transferred out. The trick is going to be the second part. The ending work in process percentages for your materials and your conversion, you have to use your percentages. Now the trick here is when they say that all materials are added at the end of conversion, that basically means that right now the materials are 0, okay? Because they have not been added yet. So in that case, you just put a 0 there, or 0% for materials. And then the problem told you that the conversion part of this was 32% complete. They told you that right up there. So if you just take 32% and multiply that by 18,000, that'll give you 5760. So I'm going to go ahead and write these numbers back up here. So you had 119,000 for both of these, and you just add them down. You get 119,000 for your materials, and you get 124,760 for conversion. That's how you calculate your equivalent units. Okay, Chapter 5, homework problem number 3. This is another equivalent unit problem. We've got the frying department of the Ripple chips. It says they have 110,000 partially completed units in work in process at the end of July. It says all of the direct materials had been added to these units, but the units were only 70% of the way through the conversion process. It says in addition, 1,050,000 units had been completed and transferred out, from the frying department to the packaging department during the month. So you got 3 steps here, 3 parts of this problem. Number 1 says how many equivalent units of direct materials and equivalent units of conversion cost are associated with the 1,050,000 units that were completed and transferred out. You got part 2, it says compute the equivalent units of direct material and equivalent units of conversion associated with the 110,000 units that were partially completed. And then the last question says, what are the total equivalent units of direct materials and, of course, for conversion? So you can see the problem down here. It's got the answers for the units completed, or sorry, for the units accounted for. But the question is, okay, so how they came up with this. So to get the actual equivalent units, so again, they had already given us the completed and transferred out. I'm just going to write this over here off to the side. So they had given the completed and transferred out units were 1,050,000. Write that here. And they had given us the ending work in process units, which is 110,000. So when the problem said that these units were partially completed in the work in process at the end of July, either way, that's essentially the ending work in process units. So what I like to do is I like to put my percent complete column there. Here's my direct materials column, and then my conversion column for direct labor and overhead. So this is always going to be implied 100% complete for the completed and transferred out. So I just essentially just copy those over, copy the 1,050,000 over. And then the other part is to deal with what are we going to plug in here for this 110,000. Well, for materials, make a note here, materials is going to be 100% complete because the problem up here said all materials have been added to these units that were partially complete. So you're done with you're done with adding direct materials. So this number right here is going to be 110,000. 1 times 110,000. For your conversion, it says 70%. So the conversion is going to be 70% multiplied by 110,000. That's going to give you the 77,000. So I'm going to write that there. And at that point, you just add them down. So you get the 1,160,000. And you get the 1,127,000. So if you go back and look at the requirements of the problem, part 1 says how many equivalent units of direct materials and equivalent units of conversion costs are associated with the 1,050,000 units. So essentially that's this part right here. It's 1,050,000. It says compute the equivalent units of direct materials and conversion associated with the 110,000. That's essentially the 110 and the 77. So that's basically this part right there. I'm going to circle that. And then finally, the total of everything, the total of all equivalent units is this bottom row right there, which is the 1,160,000 and the 1,127,000. All right, this is Chapter 5, homework problem number 4. We have at the end of October that the Cranston Bottling's mixing department had total cost to account for of this number, $739,731. And of this amount, $271,596 was for direct materials. Everything else was going to be for conversion. They also have already given you the total equivalent units. It said it's 52,230 for direct materials and 45,450 for your conversion. This problem, all they want you to do is to calculate the cost per equivalent unit for both your direct materials and conversion. So just kind of down below, just kind of show you the answer. So again, they gave you the 271,596. You just have to subtract that from 739,731 to get the conversion. And then all you do is you just divide by the equivalent unit. So for materials, you're going to divide by 52,230. For conversion, it's 45,450. And when you do that, you get these numbers, $5.20 and $10.30 for your cost per equivalent unit. Okay, this is problem 5 in Chapter 5 homework. We've got the Arctic Springs. It says they produce premium bottled water. It says they purchase this artesian water, they store it in water into large tanks, and then they run the water through 2 processes. You've got filtration and bottling. This problem is only going to be dealing with the filtration department. It says that Arctic Springs water is added at the beginning of filtration. What that essentially means is because that's your raw material, your water is going to be 100% complete for materials. It then says conversion are added evenly throughout the process. It says during December, the filtration process incurred the following costs in processing 200,000 liters. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to open up these icons to show you the data. This particular problem essentially wants you to come up with the cost of these units and I'll show you step by step how to get them. So again, in the next slide, we'll take a look at the data, and then I'll show you down below, when you see the answer to part 1, I'll show you how they're coming up with these numbers. Okay, so in this part, I'm going to walk you through the data. We've got, in this case, you got all the units summarized in terms of how to get the equivalent units. So notice they said they started the month with 0 units. They added 200,000. So again, your total physical is 200,000. They said they completed and transferred out 160. Ending WIP was 40. Notice these two again add up to the 200,000. All of your equivalent units were given to you. Notice for your direct materials, you had 160,000 that were transferred out. The 40,000 is because it says that the water is added at the beginning. Anytime they tell you that the material is going to be 100% complete. So essentially, you just add those together. Here's your 200,000 units for direct materials. And then for conversion, they just gave it to you. 34,000 is the equivalent partially completed. So 194,000 when you add those together to get the total equivalent units. Now the data, how to get this data? When I open up the data table, notice the first 3 items here. You've got workers in the filtration. That's essentially your direct labor. You got workers operating in the ozone equipment. That's basically either direct labor or overhead. And then of course this one is your overhead. If you were to add these 3 together, that's going to be your total conversion cost. The water is going to be your direct material cost. So if I add your direct labor and overhead, that's going to give you your total. Essentially, you're going to take the 9,380 plus the 9,300 plus the 24,000. I'm going to write this off over here. 9,380 plus 9,300 plus the 24,000. Okay, and then you're going to divide that by 194,000 units. When you do that, that's going to give you the 22 cents per unit. That's your cost per equivalent unit. For the water, it's just 120 divided by the 200,000. That's going to give you a 60-cent cost per equivalent unit. So if you go back and look at the previous slide and you're wondering where did they get the 22 cents and where did they get the 60 cents, this is what they would have done. Simply, it's just dividing to get your cost per equivalent unit. So now that I've showed you how to calculate the cost per equivalent unit, when you go back to the first part of this, all you're doing is you're going to take what you completed and transferred out, which is 160,000, and you're just going to then multiply by those cost per equivalent units. So for materials, it's going to be 96,000, and for conversion, it's going to be 35,200. Likewise, when you go to the second part to get the ending work in process, for materials, it's 40,000, and for conversion, it's 34. You go ahead and multiply by those same cost per equivalent units, which is 60 cents and 22 cents, and you're going to get 24,000 for materials and 74.80 for your conversion. So again, I actually already showed you this, but again, when you clicked on this reference right here, I actually showed you this in the previous slide, but again, here's how they're showing you to calculate the cost per equivalent unit. I showed you the 120,000 is essentially your water, the 42,680 was your direct labor and your overhead, but again, I showed you that you just take those and divide by your equivalent units to get your cost per equivalent unit.